Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell. The glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Let's add in a dash of Judeo-Christian ethics, the scientific revolution, and Enlightenment ideals of natural rights. Mix that all together, and you've got what is often termed Western Civilization. For its admirers, this civilization represents the very best that humanity has to offer.
Cream will rise to the top, oh yeah. I am the cream. Yeah, let me say it, yeah. Let me say it out loud. The cream of the crop. I am the cream. I am the cream, yeah.
Something that it is painstakingly constructed over many thousands of years, and now represents the pinnacle of human development.
By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West!
Is that really the case? Or is this grand narrative of Western civilization just BS? Let's talk about it. So maybe the first thing to mention is it is an odd term. I don't know if you've ever spent any significant time thinking about this. Probably it is not something that keeps you up at night going, what is Western civilization really? But obviously, to say that a civilization is Western is to imply that it is to the west of something. So one might well ask the question, well, what is Western civilization to the west of? And the answer, unhelpfully enough, is the east. Like it's precisely that vague. I think you can make a pretty solid argument that the first ones to have some sort of concept of a quote-unquote Western civilization were the ancient Greeks. And in part, they defined themselves by comparison to the folks to their east. If you look at, for example, the classical Greek historian Herodotus' account of the wars between the Greek city-states and Persia in the 5th century, this was a distinction that he played upon. That you've got these civilized Greeks over in the West and these Persian barbarians. And this is something that sort of carried forward. During the Middle Ages, you had a kind of Western Catholic Christian society that often defined itself in opposition to the Islamic lands, which lay further to the east. And even comparatively more recently, during the Cold War, the American alliance system, Nato and all that, sort of sought to define itself in opposition to the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence, which were often termed the East. So this concept, to a certain extent, depends on excluding stuff. Saying, we're the good guys in the West, these guys over in the East, they suck, they're the bad guys. Ultimately, however, every account of Western civilization, no matter where exactly it draws the dividing line, and there are all these questions like, does it include ancient Egypt? Does Western civilization include the other inheritors of the legacy of Greece and Rome? What about the Byzantine Empire and all of the Eastern Orthodox Christians up to and including Russia? Is that part of the story? What about the Islamic world? Certainly that is a society that was very much the inheritor of the monotheistic idea, of Greek philosophy, of the Roman ideal of one multinational empire under the banner of one religion. It's hard to see how that doesn't count. But ultimately, any definition of Western civilization tends to focus on the history of the Mediterranean basin and Europe. And ultimately, I mean, that really is what we're talking about. If we're talking about any course on the history of Western civilization, that is first and foremost a class on European history. If that's the case, why not just frickin' call it that, right? Well, part of the answer is that Western civilization as a concept in education has always been an ideological project, and one that is particularly spearheaded by the United States of America. You see the first courses in the history of Western civilization as such in the early 20th century. One that is particularly pointed to is a course offered at Columbia University entitled Introduction to Contemporary Civilization in the West, which started around the era of World War I. And attempted to make an argument. I mean, first of all, that there was a certain sort of general educational curricula that all university students should share, but also to make the argument that the United States represented the culmination of a heritage that stretched back several thousand years. So it attempted to link the modern United States to the European heritage stretching back to ancient Greece and Rome. And essentially, I mean, you couldn't call it a European history class because the United States was supposed to be part of it. And obviously the United States is not in Europe. Certainly courses in Western civilization were very much the rage in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, making the argument for what the United States stood for in the First and Second World Wars, and also into the Cold War as well, that there was a certain type of cultural heritage that the United States at its best represented. Obviously, though, this grand narrative is something of a distortion. I mean, if you're attempting to link all of these societies together, I mean, when you think about it, even on just the basis of the governmental system, if you take classical Athens, the Roman Republic, the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, Elizabethan England, revolutionary France, colonial America, and modern America. Like each one of those was a different thing, often with profoundly different values. Certainly you can make a case that there were certain cultural legacies that they all shared, but you can make just as strong an argument that each one of them was a separate, distinct entity. It also is a narrative that leaves an awful lot out. I mean, certainly if you want to portray the United States primarily as the creation of a European culture that stretches back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that's not the reality of the United States' history. That really what it represents is a blending of cultures. That certainly you have the European colonists who came to North America, but you also had the cultures of the native peoples that were here first and that were largely sort of swept aside and in many cases murdered by the European colonists. And you also had the culture and civilization of the Africans who were brought to function as slave labor. And America has always sort of straddled itself on the nexus of all of those cultures. And that's just for its early part. Once you get to the more modern history of the United States, obviously immigrants from all over the world brought their own cultural norms, a lot of which had nothing to do with Europe. So it's definitely a very skewed way of viewing American history as solely a European creation. Also, too, it leaves out some of the more unpleasant bits. You know, it represents history as progress, getting better and better. In order to do that, you've got to overlook some of the grimmer tidbits. You know, the authoritarian system of the Roman Empire, the social controls of medieval feudalism, the transatlantic slave trade, genocide of Native Americans, European imperialism, the Holocaust of European Jews. Like, all of that is just as much a part of European history as Athenian democracy or the Roman Republic or the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution. You know, one of the things that ends up being kind of bundled up with any notion of Western civilization is often a quote-unquote canon of Western literature. We might reference, for example, Harvard University's great book series that included some 51 volumes that made its debut in 1909. I don't have that series, but if you look at the bookshelf behind me, I do have a very similar series, the Britannica Great Books series, and, well, let's take a little look at who's there. So we got Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Plutarch, Virgil, Thomas Aquinas, Dante, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Cervantes, John Milton, John Locke, Montesquieu, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, Herman Melville, Charles Darwin. I wonder what all those people had in common. What could it be? Yeah, of course. All of those people are white men. which is a pretty exclusive canon of literature. And this is not to say anything against, Plato or Shakespeare or Chaucer or any of those dudes. That stuff is awesome. But at the same time, you're definitely going to be missing some stuff. It is an impoverished education that does not include some of these other cultures of the world. And I would submit that if your great books list does not include Sappho, does not include Lao Tzu, does not include Nagarjuna, does not include Chinua Achebe, does not include Leslie Marmon Silko or Angela Davis, there are big gaps. There's a great deal to learn from those authors from other cultures, other civilizations. They have something valuable to contribute to the dialogue of human history, and they should be studied as well. And, the whiteness of Western civilization, that is something that is worth considering.
What white nonsense is this?
I do recall in one of my courses on Western civilization several years ago, I did one of the things that you sometimes get like the first day of class, where we go around the room and all of the students share a little bit about themselves and why they're taking the course. Stuff like that. It's the sort of thing that students tend to dread. But at any rate, we got to this one student and she said, well, I've taken a lot of classes on African American history, but I'm taking this class on Western civilization because I thought it was time for me to take a class on the history of white people. Which produced a nervous giggle of the sort that anytime you talk about race in the United States, you tend to get. Makes people uncomfortable. But you know what? I think she put her finger on something that is significant about Western civilization as a concept, that in many ways, it really is the history of white people. By design, it's the history of white people. It emphasizes their experiences and their contributions to the human past, at the expense of the history of other civilizations. And if you look at certain scumbag white nationalists, I called them scumbags, deal with it. If you're a white nationalist, this video is probably not for you to begin with, right? And I recommend you rethink your life. But it's interesting how often you will hear them talk about the importance of Western civilization and how Western civilization should be studied and how, we're just too PC to appreciate the value of Western civ and stuff like that. And this is in part it's a code. It is no longer acceptable to say overtly racist stuff. But white nationalists have gotten very good at coming up with more polite ways of conveying the same thing. And if you look at the context, the comments of some of these people about Western civilization, the upshot is always that it is about white culture and white civilization that they want to privilege. And, are all of the admirers of Western civilization white nationalists or white supremacists? No, obviously not. But, on the other hand, it certainly is possible, even if you do not yourself hold consciously bigoted views or have personal hatred for another racial group, it is possible nonetheless to support and even perpetuate racist systems. That's how systemic racism works. It does not require people to hate other races to thrive. It is a social superstructure that keeps disparities of power between racial groups in place. And it does not require overt hatred to function. And this has real consequences. I teach at a 2-year community college, and I'm proud to do so. A good 50% of our students are people of color. A lot of our students also come from comparatively low-income households. So the whole project of placing higher education within the reach of people who might not otherwise have had a chance to obtain it, I think is a great thing. Now, a lot of our students, more than 50% who graduate, transfer to another local 4-year university. And it just so happens that one of the donors to this university, even though it is a public institution, is the Koch Foundation. This was started by the late David Koch and his brother Charles Koch, who is currently the world's 11th richest human being with a personal fortune of some $50.5 billion. I don't think it's terribly controversial for me to label Charles Koch as somebody who is to the far right of the American political spectrum. He is a supporter of a particular vision of free market capitalism, arguing for minimal corporate taxes, as little government regulation as possible. He is also big time into climate change denial, in part because most of his fortune comes from fossil fuels. He doesn't want any regulations on that. He doesn't want people to switch away from it. And one of the things that the Koch Foundation is into, in addition to that stuff, is also to promote the teaching of Western civilization. Now, the foundation denies that it exerts any influence whatsoever on the hiring and firing of faculty at universities and colleges that it donates to, or over the curriculum or anything like that. But I mean, one could be forgiven for being a little bit suspicious of that assertion. Like, I don't think we are in conspiracy theory territory here to think that if somebody gives tens of millions of dollars to an educational institution, then the powers that be at that university are probably going to pay some attention to the preferences of that entity. There is going to be some influence there, no matter how much they want to deny it. But I mean, I think the part that's interesting here is that, the Koch Foundation doesn't donate to my college. And yet, because this four-year university is the recipient of Koch Foundation money, Western Civilization satisfies an awful lot of requirements there. Since so many of my college's students want to transfer there, that means that we teach a lot of the history of Western civilization. I teach a lot of those classes. So think about what that means for a minute. That because one very rich white dude gave money to a college that my students do not attend, some of them may not even want to attend, that has an impact still on the classes that they take. Because Charles Koch is a fan of white people history, so many of the students at my college end up taking it. That's an interesting scenario, isn't it? All right, recommended readings for Western civilization. If you were looking for an articulate and well-informed defense of Western civilization as a concept, David Gress's From Plato to Nato, The Idea of the West and Its Opponents, is an interesting, thoughtful book. Probably puts the best possible foot forward for Western civilization and why it should still be studied. If you're looking for more of a critique of that, Edward Said's Orientalism provides a discussion of how Western scholars studying the Islamic Middle East, how their perspective as Europeans ended up distorting their view of the rest of the world. In many ways, this is one of the seminal critiques of how warping the West can be as a concept in constructing an East to be opposed to. If you found some of the stuff we were talking about with the Koch Foundation interesting, you might check out Christopher Leonard's Kochland, The Secret History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. So in many ways, Western civilization as a concept is so vague as to be completely unhelpful, presents a distorted narrative of the human past that leaves far too many important things out, and at its very worst, is indeed some racist BS. How to fix it? Like, just be honest about it. Call it what it is, European history, which is great. Like, I've devoted my scholarly career to the study of the history of Europe. It is wonderful, interesting stuff. It is worth studying. But also, don't give it any more weight in a curriculum than the history of any of the other societies of the world. There is much of value in European history, but there is just as much of value in the history of Asia, or in the history of Africa, or in the history of Latin America. And the history of all of those regions should satisfy just as many requirements as any European history course. So fix that, and then we're fine. It's not BS at all. But, until then, I'm afraid it will remain BS. All right. Hope that helps. Check your sources. See you later. Bye.